the widow's gambit. The poker chips fell like autumn leaves across the green felt table as Victoria Sterling watched 3 years of careful planning collapse in a single hand. Across from her sat the man she'd come to destroy, railroad baron Marcus Blackwood, the same Marcus Blackwood who'd orchestrated her husband's murder and stolen their mining claims. But instead of the triumph she'd expected, she found herself staring at a royal flush while holding nothing but a pair of threes. "Seems Lady Luck has abandoned you, Mrs. Sterling," Blackwood said, his voice smooth as aged whiskey, as he gathered the chips that represented her entire fortune. "Perhaps you should have stayed home with your needlework instead of trying to play games with the men." Victoria's fingers tightened around her cards, but she kept her expression neutral. The saloon around them had grown quiet, every gambler and drifter watching to see how the elegant widow from Denver would handle losing everything she owned to the most powerful man in Colorado territory. But what they didn't know, what Blackwood himself didn't know, was that Victoria Sterling hadn't come to win at poker. She'd come to lose, spectacularly, publicly, in exactly the way that would force Blackwood to make the mistake she'd been waiting 3 years for him to make. The real game wasn't being played at this table. It was being played in the shadows of territorial politics, in the boardrooms of competing railroad companies, and in the hearts of men who believed a grieving widow was too broken to pose a threat to their carefully constructed empire of corruption and violence. Victoria Sterling was about to prove them catastrophically wrong. But to understand how a Denver socialite had become the most dangerous player in the Colorado Territory's deadliest game, we need to go back to the night that transformed a pampered railroad heiress into a calculating engine of revenge. Back to when she discovered that her husband's death in a mining accident wasn't an accident at all, but the opening move in a war she didn't even know was being fought. Denver, Colorado Territory, 1881. Victoria Sterling stood at the window of her mansion's library, watching snow fall over the city her husband had helped build. 3 months had passed since James Sterling's death in the Colorado mountain mine collapse, and she was still struggling to understand how the most safety-conscious mining engineer in the territory had been killed by faulty support beams in a shaft he'd personally inspected the day before. The official investigation had concluded it was a tragic accident, old timber weakened by groundwater, combined with an unusual shift in the geological structure that no engineer could have predicted. The Territorial Mining Commission had accepted. The findings paid out the standard compensation to the Sterling estate and closed the case. But Victoria couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with the official story. James had been obsessive about mine safety, had developed new techniques for testing structural integrity that had saved hundreds of lives in mines across the territory. It seemed impossible that he would have missed warning signs serious enough to cause a complete shaft collapse. She'd tried to investigate on her own, but her inquiries had been met with polite sympathy and gentle suggestions that she should leave such technical matters to men who understood mining operations. The mine foreman, the safety inspector, even the territorial commissioner had all spoken to her with the patronizing kindness reserved for grieving widows who didn't understand the complexities of their late husband's work. Tonight, however, Victoria had finally found someone willing to treat her questions seriously. Thomas Chun, a Chinese engineer who'd worked with James on several mining projects, had agreed to meet with her privately to discuss his concerns about the official investigation. Mrs. Sterling, Chun said, accepting the cup of tea she'd poured from the service set beside her desk, "I must tell you that what I'm about to say could be dangerous for both of us." Victoria felt her pulse quicken. "What do you mean?" Chun reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document covered in technical drawings and calculations. "These are the structural analyses your husband performed on the Colorado mountain mine 3 days before his death. I helped him prepare them." Victoria studied the pages, recognizing James's precise handwriting and meticulous attention to detail. The calculations showed that the mine's support structures were not only adequate, but exceeded safety requirements by a significant margin. According to these measurements, the mine should have been completely stable. "That's correct. Your husband was preparing to recommend expanding operations in that section because the geological conditions were so favorable." Chun's voice grew quieter. "Mrs. Sterling, I've examined the wreckage of that tunnel. The support beams that allegedly failed weren't weakened by age or water damage. They were cut deliberately." Victoria set down her teacup with shaking hands. "You're saying James was murdered?" "I'm saying someone wanted that section of the mine to collapse, and they didn't care that your husband would be killed in the process." Chun leaned forward. "But Mrs. Sterling, there's something else you need to know. The Colorado mountain mine isn't just a mining operation. It's sitting on top of the planned route for the Denver and Pacific Railroad's eastern expansion." Victoria felt pieces of a puzzle beginning to fall into place in her mind. The railroad needs that land. More than needs it. Marcus Blackwood has been buying up mining claims along the proposed route for months, but the Colorado mountain mine was one of the few operations he couldn't purchase. The owners were making too much money to sell, so he found another way to acquire it. Chun nodded grimly. "A mine with a history of fatal accidents becomes worthless. Investors flee, property values collapse, and suddenly Marcus Blackwood can buy valuable railroad right-of-way for pennies on the dollar." Victoria stood and walked to the window, staring out at the snow-covered city where her husband's murderer was probably sleeping peacefully in his mansion, convinced he'd committed the perfect crime. "Mr. Chun, do you have any proof of this beyond your engineering analysis?" "Some. I've documented the evidence of deliberate sabotage, and I have records showing Blackwood's agents approached the mine owners with purchase offers just days after." "Your husband's death," Chun hesitated. "But Mrs. Sterling, this isn't the kind of evidence that would hold up in territorial court. Blackwood owns too many judges and politicians." "Then what do you suggest?" Chun was quiet for a long moment, studying Victoria's face in the lamplight. When he spoke, his voice carried a warning. "I suggest you be very careful, Mrs. Sterling. Marcus Blackwood has killed before to protect his railroad interests, and he won't hesitate to kill again if he feels threatened. A grieving widow asking uncomfortable questions could easily become the victim of another tragic accident." Victoria turned from the window to face Chun directly. "Mr. Chun, are you telling me to forget about my husband's murder and let his killers profit from his death? I am telling you that justice and survival don't always go together. Sometimes the only way to stay alive is to appear defeated." Victoria considered his words carefully. She was a woman alone in a territory controlled by men who viewed her as either a helpless victim or a potential threat to be eliminated. If she tried to fight Blackwood directly, using conventional methods, she would probably end up as dead as James. But if she appeared to be the broken widow everyone expected her to be, if she seemed to accept the official story about James's accidental death, she might be able to investigate and plan without attracting Blackwood's attention. "Mr. Chun, I need you to do something for me." "What?" "I need you to forget we had this conversation. If anyone asks, you offered your condolences about James's tragic accident, and I thanked you politely, but didn't express any doubts about the official investigation." Chun studied her face, understanding dawning. "And what will you be doing while I'm forgetting our conversation?" Victoria smiled, and for the first time since James's death, she felt purpose returning to her life. "I'll be playing the part of the grieving widow while I figure out exactly how to destroy Marcus Blackwood." Over the following months, Sterling became exactly what Denver society expected a wealthy widow to be: subdued, charitable, focused on managing her late husband's estate and finding appropriate ways to honor his memory. She attended church regularly, hosted dinner parties for other prominent widows, and made generous donations to causes that James had supported. But she also did something else. She began studying Marcus Blackwood with the same methodical precision James had used to analyze geological structures. She learned that Blackwood's railroad empire was built on a foundation of political corruption, financial manipulation, and strategic violence. He bribed territorial officials to secure favorable legislation, used insider information to purchase land before railroad routes were announced publicly, and eliminated competitors through methods ranging from economic warfare to outright murder. She discovered that James wasn't Blackwood's first victim. At least a dozen men had died in accidents after opposing Blackwood's railroad projects, or refusing to sell him property he needed. Mine collapses, building fires, wagon accidents, hunting mishaps, all tragic, all apparently random, all conveniently removing obstacles to Blackwood's expansion plans. But she also learned something else about Marcus Blackwood that gave her hope. Despite his wealth and power, he had a weakness that could potentially be exploited. He was a compulsive gambler. Not the casual gambling that most wealthy men indulged in, but a genuine addiction that had cost him millions of dollars over the years. He owned controlling interests in several gambling establishments, not just for the profits, but because he needed places where he could play for the high stakes that satisfied his craving for risk. Victoria began to formulate a plan that would use Blackwood's gambling addiction against him, but it would require her to become someone she'd never been before. A skilled card player capable of competing with professional gamblers, a strategic thinker who could manipulate men like pieces on a chessboard, a woman willing to risk everything on a single, perfectly timed gamble. She hired tutors to teach her poker, faro, and other gambling games popular in Colorado Territory. She studied the psychology of risk-taking and learned to read the subtle tells that revealed when players were bluffing. She practiced for hours, every day, developing the skills she would need to compete at the highest levels of territorial gambling. But more importantly, she began building a network of allies and informants throughout Colorado Territory. She cultivated friendships with other widows who'd lost husbands to Blackwood's expansion projects. She established relationships with newspaper editors who were tired of being intimidated by railroad money. She even reached out to competitors of Blackwood's railroad company, who might be willing to support efforts to undermine his operations. By the summer of 1884, Victoria Sterling had transformed herself from a grieving widow into a formidable opponent. She had the skills, the allies, and the detailed knowledge of Blackwood's operations that she would need to bring him down. She also had a plan that would either destroy Marcus Blackwood or get her killed in the attempt. The plan was elegantly simple in concept, but would require flawless execution. Victoria would provoke Blackwood into a high-stakes poker game by appearing to be a wealthy but inexperienced gambler who could be easily beaten. She would lose deliberately, allowing him to win her entire fortune and creating the impression that she was financially ruined. But the poker game wasn't the real objective. It was camouflage for what Victoria really intended to accomplish. While Blackwood was focused on taking her money, she would be gathering evidence of his criminal activities and positioning herself to expose his corruption to territorial and federal authorities. The appearance of being a broken woman who'd lost everything gambling would provide perfect cover for the systematic destruction of his railroad empire. The plan had taken 3 years to develop and implement. Now, sitting across from Blackwood at a poker table in the Silver Dollar Saloon, Victoria was about to discover whether all her preparation had been sufficient to bring down the man who'd murdered her husband. The royal flush glittering in Blackwood's hand suggested that she might have underestimated her opponent. "I'm afraid that concludes our evening, Mrs. Sterling," Blackwood said, stacking the chips that represented her entire visible fortune. "Though I must say you've been remarkably gracious about losing. Most people become quite emotional when they've gambled away everything they own." Victoria smiled ruefully, projecting the image of a woman trying to maintain dignity in defeat. "My late husband always said that losing gracefully was the mark of good breeding, though I suspect he never imagined I'd have occasion to lose quite this much." Blackwood laughed, genuinely amused by what he perceived as her naive acceptance. "A financial ruin, indeed. Perhaps this will serve as an education about the dangers of gambling beyond one's means." Around them, the saloon's patrons were beginning to disperse. The evening's entertainment concluded with Victoria's spectacular loss. But a few men lingered near the bar, nursing drinks and discussing the extraordinary sum of money that had changed hands during the game. Victoria noticed that one of the lingering customers was Thomas Chun, the engineer who'd first told her about the evidence of sabotage in the Colorado mountain mine. Their eyes met briefly across the smoky saloon, and she saw him nod almost imperceptibly. Phase 1 of her plan was complete. Now Phase 2 could begin. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, gathering her reticule and preparing to leave, "I don't suppose you'd be interested in giving me an opportunity to win back some of my losses?" Blackwood's eyes sharpened with interest. "I thought you just lost everything you owned, Mrs. Sterling." "Everything liquid, yes. But I still have property, mining claims, investments that could be liquidated if necessary." Victoria allowed a note of desperation to creep into her voice. "Perhaps we could arrange a private game? Higher stakes, better odds for both of us." "Mrs. Sterling, I'd hate to see you dig yourself into an even deeper hole. Surely you've learned your lesson about gambling with professionals?" Victoria leaned forward slightly, projecting the image of a woman whose judgment had been compromised by desperation and grief. "Mr. Blackwood, I have nothing left to lose and everything to gain. Surely a man of your expertise wouldn't be threatened by one more game with a clearly outmatched opponent?" The challenge was subtle but unmistakable, designed to appeal to Blackwood's ego and his gambling addiction. Victoria could see him weighing the risks and benefits, calculating how much more money he could extract from a desperate widow who refused to accept defeat. "Very well, Mrs. Sterling, one more game. Tomorrow evening at my private club. But I warn you, the stakes will be much higher than anything we played tonight." Victoria stood and extended her hand with the formal courtesy of Denver society. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood. You're very generous to give me another chance." As they shook hands, Victoria felt a small thrill of satisfaction. Blackwood thought he was setting up an inexperienced woman for even greater losses. Instead, he was walking directly into the trap she'd spent 3 years preparing. Tomorrow evening would determine whether Victoria Sterling's gamble on justice would pay off, or whether she would join her husband as another victim of Marcus Blackwood's ruthless ambition. But first, she had 24 hours to make sure every element of her plan was perfectly positioned for what would either be her triumph or her destruction. The real game was about to begin. Victoria left the Silver Dollar Saloon and walked through Denver's gaslit streets toward her mansion, maintaining the posture and pace of a woman dealing with devastating financial loss. But inside, her mind was racing through the final preparations for tomorrow night's confrontation. She deliberately lost tonight's game to create the impression that she was an incompetent gambler driven by grief and desperation. Blackwood now saw her as easy prey, a wealthy widow whose poor judgment could be exploited for significant profit. That perception was crucial to the success of her real plan, because tomorrow night, when Blackwood thought he was fleecing another victim, Victoria Sterling would reveal exactly how dangerous an underestimated woman could become. The widow's gambit was entering its final phase. Victoria arrived at her mansion to find Thomas Chun waiting in her library with 2 other men she'd been expecting. One was federal prosecutor William Harrison from the territorial capital, a man whose integrity couldn't be bought by railroad money. The other was Detective Captain Murphy from the Denver Police Department, one of the few local law enforcement officials who wasn't on Blackwood's payroll. "Gentlemen," Victoria said, removing her gloves and settling into the chair behind her desk, "I trust you've reviewed the materials I sent you?" Prosecutor Harrison nodded gravely. "Mrs. Sterling, if your information is accurate, we're looking at one of the largest criminal conspiracies in territorial history. Murder, bribery, fraud, extortion. Blackwood's organization has violated every law designed to protect citizens from corporate abuse." "The information is accurate, Mr. Harrison. I've spent 3 years documenting every crime, every bribed official, every suspicious death connected to Blackwood's railroad expansion." Victoria opened her desk drawer and withdrew a thick folder. "But documentation isn't enough. We need evidence that will hold up in federal court." Detective Captain Murphy leaned forward. "What kind of evidence?" "The kind that can only be obtained through direct observation and recorded testimony." Victoria spread several documents across her desk. "Tomorrow evening, Marcus Blackwood will be hosting a private gathering at his club. Not just a poker game, but a strategy meeting with his key associates and corrupt officials. Thomas Chun spoke up. How do you know this? Because I've been cultivating relationships with people throughout Denver society for 3 years. The wives of railroad executives hear things their husbands assume they don't understand. The servants in powerful men's homes observe conversations their employers think are private. Victoria smiled grimly. Amazing what people will reveal when they don't think women are listening. Prosecutor Harrison examined the documents Victoria had provided. According to this, Blackwood is planning to announce the next phase of his expansion project tomorrow night, including which properties he intends to acquire and which obstacles he plans to eliminate. Exactly. And he's going to do it in front of witnesses who can testify about his methods under federal immunity agreements. Victoria looked at each man in turn. Gentlemen, tomorrow night we're going to record Marcus Blackwood confessing to murder, conspiracy, and systematic corruption of territorial government. Detective Captain Murphy frowned. Mrs. Sterling, how exactly do you plan to record these confessions? Blackwood's club is private property, heavily guarded, and he's not likely to admit to crimes in front of strangers. Victoria walked to her desk and opened another drawer, revealing a small mechanical device that looked like an elaborate pocket watch. This is Edison's latest invention, a portable phonograph recorder, modified by a friend of mine who's skilled with mechanical devices. It can record up to 30 minutes of conversation clearly enough to be understood by anyone who hears the playback. The 3 men stared at the device with expressions ranging from amazement to skepticism. Mrs. Sterling, Prosecutor Harrison said slowly, are you proposing to secretly record criminal confessions using experimental technology? I'm proposing to gather evidence of crimes that have gone unpunished for too long. Victoria's voice carried steel beneath its cultured veneer. My husband is dead because Marcus Blackwood values railroad profits more than human lives. If the law won't protect innocent people from men like him, then those of us who've been victimized will have to protect ourselves. Thomas Chun studied the phonograph recorder with professional interest. How do you plan to get this into Blackwood's club without being detected? Victoria smiled, and her expression held anticipation mixed with grim satisfaction. Mr. Chun, I've spent 3 years learning everything there is to know about Marcus Blackwood. His habits, his weaknesses, his blind spots. Tomorrow night, he's going to invite me into his private office to negotiate the terms of our poker game, and he's going to do it because he believes I'm a desperate woman who poses no threat to him. And while you're negotiating? While I'm negotiating, this device will be recording every word he says about his criminal activities. Because Marcus Blackwood's greatest weakness isn't his gambling addiction. It's his ego. He loves to explain how clever he is, how he's outmaneuvered everyone who's tried to stop him. Victoria's eyes hardened. Tomorrow night, his need to boast about his crimes is going to destroy him. Detective Captain Murphy looked concerned. Mrs. Sterling, this is extremely dangerous. If Blackwood discovers what you're doing, he'll kill you without hesitation. Perhaps. But if I do nothing, he'll continue killing other people's husbands to protect his railroad empire. Victoria gathered the documents from her desk. Gentlemen, I've made my choice. The question is whether you're prepared to do your jobs when I provide you with evidence of Blackwood's crimes. Prosecutor Harrison stood and extended his hand. "Mrs. Sterling, you have my word. If you can provide credible evidence of criminal activity, I'll prosecute Marcus Blackwood to the full extent of federal law." Detective Captain Murphy nodded his agreement. "And you'll have police protection during and after the operation. We won't let you face this alone." After the men left, Victoria sat alone in her library, preparing for what might be the last night of her life. Tomorrow evening she would walk into Marcus Blackwood's private domain carrying the tools to destroy him. If her plan succeeded, she would finally have justice for James's murder and protection for countless future victims. If her plan failed, she would join her husband in death, and Marcus Blackwood would continue his reign of corruption and violence unchallenged. But Victoria Sterling had learned something during 3 years of patient planning and careful preparation. Sometimes the only way to defeat a monster was to become more ruthless than the monster himself. Tomorrow night, Marcus Blackwood would discover that the grieving widow he'd dismissed as harmless was actually the most dangerous enemy he'd ever faced. The widow's gambit was about to reach its climax. Victoria spent the morning of the final confrontation making arrangements that would take effect regardless of whether she survived the evening. She updated her will to ensure that her fortune would fund continued investigations into railroad corruption. She wrote detailed letters to newspaper editors in 3 territories, explaining the evidence against Blackwood and providing instructions for publishing the information if something happened to her. She even arranged for Thomas Chun to receive copies of all her documentation, ensuring that the truth about James's murder would eventually come to light. But most importantly, she prepared herself mentally for the confrontation ahead. She would be walking into enemy territory, surrounded by men who'd killed before and wouldn't hesitate to kill again if they felt threatened. Her only weapons would be her intelligence, her preparation, and the recording device that would either capture evidence of Blackwood's crimes or become evidence of her own murder. As evening approached, Victoria dressed carefully in a gown that projected wealth and sophistication while concealing the phonograph recorder in specially designed pockets. She practiced activating the device until she could operate it by touch, alone ensuring that she could begin recording without drawing attention to her actions. At 8 o'clock, her carriage arrived at the Territorial Club, Marcus Blackwood's private establishment where Colorado's most powerful men gathered to conduct business away from public scrutiny. The building was elegant but fortress-like, with guards at every entrance and windows positioned to provide clear fields of fire against potential attackers. Victoria was escorted through richly appointed rooms filled with railroad executives, territorial officials, and other men whose wealth and influence shaped Colorado's future. Many of them nodded politely as she passed, recognizing her as the widow of a prominent mining engineer, but having no idea that she was about to destroy their carefully constructed world of privilege and corruption. Marcus Blackwood met her at the entrance to his private office, dressed in expensive evening clothes and radiating the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. "Mrs. Sterling, how lovely to see you again. I trust you're prepared for this evening's entertainment?" As prepared as a woman can be when gambling with her last remaining assets, Victoria replied, allowing a note of nervous determination to color her voice. Blackwood gestured for her to enter his office, A richly appointed room dominated by a massive desk and lined with maps showing railroad routes throughout the Western Territories. 3 other men were already present, men Victoria, recognized as key figures in Blackwood's organization. Mrs. Sterling, allow me to introduce my associates. These gentlemen will be witnessing our agreement to ensure there are no misunderstandings about the terms of tonight's game. Victoria nodded to each man while discreetly activating the recording device concealed in her gown. The phonograph began, silently capturing every word spoken in the room. Mr. Blackwood, before we discuss gambling terms, I'm curious about something. You seem remarkably confident for a man playing against someone who might get lucky and win back her fortune. Blackwood laughed, settling into his chair with the relaxed air of a predator who'd cornered helpless prey. Mrs. Sterling, I'm confident, because I never gamble in anything I can't control. Your husband learned that lesson the hard way. Victoria felt her pulse quicken, but she kept her expression neutral. What do you mean? I mean that James Sterling was a problem that required a permanent solution. He refused to sell me the mining claims I needed for my railroad expansion, so I arranged for him to have an accident that would motivate the other owners to be more flexible in their negotiations. One of Blackwood's associates shifted uncomfortably. Marcus, perhaps we shouldn't discuss. Shouldn't discuss what? The business methods that have made us all wealthy? Blackwood's voice carried the pride of a man showing off his cleverness. Mrs. Sterling is hardly in a position to cause problems for us, and it's important that she understands how the real world operates. Victoria leaned forward slightly, projecting fascination rather than horror. You're saying you had my husband killed? I'm saying your husband's death was a necessary business expense. The Colorado Mountain Mine was sitting on valuable railroad right-of-way, and the owners wouldn't sell at any reasonable price. A tragic mining accident solved that problem quite efficiently. And the territorial investigation? The territorial investigation reached the conclusions I paid them to reach. Blackwood's smile was genuinely amused. Mrs. Sterling, you've lived a very sheltered life if you think government officials can't be purchased like any other commodity. Victoria nodded as if accepting a valuable lesson, while inside she felt savage satisfaction at how easily Blackwood was incriminating himself. The recording device was capturing every word of his confession, creating evidence that would destroy him and his entire organization. I see. And tonight's poker game? Tonight's poker game will complete the process your husband's death began. You'll lose your remaining assets to me, eliminating any potential claims against the Colorado Mountain. Mine properties. The transition of ownership will be clean and legal, with no surviving heirs to complicate future development. No surviving heirs? Victoria kept her voice steady despite understanding the implication. Mrs. Sterling, wealthy widows who gamble. Away their fortunes sometimes suffer tragic accidents on their way home from unsuccessful evenings. The roads between here and Denver can be quite dangerous, especially in winter weather. Victoria realized that Blackwood was planning to kill her, regardless of how the poker game ended. He'd brought her here not just to steal her money, but to eliminate her as a potential threat to his operations. But he'd also done exactly what she'd hoped he would do. He'd confessed to murder, conspiracy, and systematic corruption while surrounded by witnesses and within range of her recording device. That's very thorough planning, Mr. Blackwood. Though I have to ask, what if I actually win tonight's game? Blackwood's expression darkened. Mrs. Sterling, I told you before that I never gamble on things I can't control. Tonight's game has been arranged to ensure that you lose everything you own, including your life. I see. Well, in that case, gentlemen, I suppose we should get this over with. Victoria stood and walked to the center of the room, where she could address all four men simultaneously. Then she smiled, and for the first time that evening she allowed her true feelings to show in her expression. Marcus Blackwood, you've just confessed to murdering my husband, bribing territorial officials, and planning to kill me tonight. You've done it in front of 3 witnesses, and within range of a recording device that's captured every word you've spoken. The room erupted into chaos as Blackwood and his associates realized they'd been trapped. But Victoria had planned for this moment, too. The doors to Blackwood's office burst open to admit Detective Captain Murphy and 6 heavily armed police officers, followed by Prosecutor Harrison and Thomas Chum. The federal agents had been waiting outside, listening through the thin walls, for Victoria's signal that she'd obtained the evidence they needed. Marcus Blackwood, Prosecutor Harrison announced, you're under arrest for murder, conspiracy, bribery, and intimidation of federal witnesses. As handcuffs were placed on Blackwood and his associates, Victoria felt 3 years of patient planning finally reached their conclusion. The man who'd murdered her husband was going to face justice, and his criminal organization was going to be dismantled completely. But more than that, Victoria Sterling had proven that sometimes the most effective way to fight corruption was to make the corrupt believe they were safe while you gathered the evidence to destroy them. The widow's gambit had succeeded beyond her wildest expectations. 6 months later, Marcus Blackwood's trial became the most publicized criminal case in Colorado Territory's history. The recordings Victoria had made in his office, combined with testimony from witnesses who'd been granted federal immunity, exposed a network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. Blackwood was convicted of murder in the first degree and sentenced to hang. 12 territorial officials were convicted of bribery and removed from office. The entire structure of railroad development in Colorado Territory was reformed under federal oversight. Victoria Sterling became a celebrated figure throughout the American West, not just for bringing a murderer to justice, but for demonstrating how individual courage and careful planning could triumph over systematic corruption. She used her restored fortune to establish a foundation that investigated suspicious deaths connected to corporate expansion, ensuring that other families wouldn't suffer the losses she'd endured. She never remarried, dedicating her life to the pursuit of justice for people who couldn't fight powerful enemies on their own. When she died in 1923, at the age of 71, her funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives had been saved or improved by her work. The inscription on her tombstone, chosen by Victoria herself, read simply, "She played the long game, and she won." But perhaps her most fitting memorial was the federal law passed the year after Blackwood's execution, requiring independent oversight of all major railroad construction projects and establishing harsh penalties for corporate officials who used violence to acquire property rights. The Sterling Act became the foundation for federal regulation of corporate expansion in the American West, ensuring that Victoria's victory over Marcus Blackwood would protect future generations from the kind of institutional corruption that had cost James Sterling his life. Victoria Sterling had entered the deadliest game in Colorado Territory as a grieving widow with nothing left to lose. She'd emerged as the architect of systematic reform that would reshape how America's industrial expansion was conducted. The widow's gambit had become the template for how ordinary citizens could fight back against extraordinary corruption, and when.